So looking forward, as we think about the very near term, as we're approaching December and getting into 2023, what are the most interesting opportunities we can see? And one of the fundamental beliefs I have is the most interesting opportunities are maybe things yet to be discovered. There's basic science, there's fundamental research that leads to some very interesting applications. And of course, we're seeing some very interesting technologies that have already been developed, and then understanding how to best take advantage of those and where those opportunities are. These are the things that we look at going forward. So one of the things we look at is artificial intelligence. And one of the things about artificial intelligence is there's a lot that's misunderstood. And there's some topics that I've discussed earlier, which is it still has some fundamental inefficiencies, even as we understand with more data, better processing. There's still a quality of data that's essential within artificial intelligence. But the one thing that it really does represent, I call it a platform for disruption, right? Because it really is a tool and a very effective tool, and that kind of insight can disrupt so many industries in so many ways, and it's a way to capture great value even from current processes or invent new processes. Even when we saw a firm like Google apply their artificial intelligence systems to their energy usage, they were able to increase their energy efficiency by 40%, right? So these are dramatic improvements from just understanding how basic systems work. And so as we talked about before, there's a big difference between just a lot of data and maybe a quality of data, right? So useful data doesn't mean collect data from everywhere and figure out what's useful. Our systems really don't work well that way. Understanding the dynamic nature of information, learning how to learn, separating data into useful packets, understanding what usefulness is really there, refining that, and creating better data sets is really a goal for the future. It doesn't scale from where we are today. So we need to have much more efficient and better data usages. And I call it, the sharpened rock, right? So go back to the days of maybe the Neanderthal or whatever it is in prehistoric times when mankind finally figured out how to sharpen a rock. Well, that made a big difference now. Suddenly we could create many more useful tools and many more useful things. And artificial intelligence is really the modern day sharpened rock. It's a way for us to create tools and create processes and create things that are much more efficient. In and of itself, it really is just a tool. And so it's a better way for us to do things. And those applications can create tremendous value. So something I'm calling the new industrial revolution. So there's a couple things going on. One is we've had globalization that was ascendant, and now it's not, right? It's turned into sort of a political maelstrom, and now we want more isolationism. We've got political risk to cross-border transactions. So comparative advantage is giving way to localized specialty. And so a great example, of course, is integrated circuits, where we're now bringing that kind of manufacturing capability back to the United States. Well, with tens of billions of dollars being invested, we're looking for efficiencies, we're looking for ways to make that more cost effective. They haven't been, which is why we've been overseas. But if we're going to create, I'll call it an inefficiency that scaling back from globalization fundamentally creates, if we're going to do that, then we're going to need not only this localized specialty, but ways to make that industrial process much more efficient. So let's call it the new industrial revolution, where just as power, whether it was thermodynamically generated power, enabled an industrial revolution in the first place, now we need software tools, software innovation to bring the new industrial revolution where we're more efficient, we have better processes, better ways to handle things if we're going to localize things. So we've introduced inefficiency into our process. Now we have to find a way to extract inefficiency and create efficiency. Doing that will be a great opportunity. And so this will require additional innovation, and that will create more efficient manufacturing. And that's the virtuous cycle that I think the new industrial revolution can create. And that will be created by artificial intelligence and software engineering. So the other topic which gets a lot of attention is power. So power is prosperity, right? So we've experienced this in the Western world. Now China has experienced it. India is experiencing it. And, about 4 billion other people would like to experience it, and they don't have it. The side effect of that prosperity is climate crisis. And we have to deal with not only the changes in weather, but pollution and assorted other impacts on our livelihoods, which are very draconian and existential to some degree, right? But the problem is that we have to define the problem properly first. And, in Vaclav Smil's book, How the World Really Works, he identifies there's 4 pillars to society, which aren't going away anytime soon, and in fact are increasing. And they are steel, cement, plastics, and fertilizer. All of these are essential to the modern world. All of these require tremendous amounts of energy and processing, and we can't just be carbon neutral in 20, 30, or even 50 years just on these processes alone. So we need something much more fundamental. We need a breakthrough, right? And I call it like the orchestra. So in other words, we need to orchestrate where power is generated. And if we're using alternative energy, we really need to orchestrate the source of that alternative energy with the application of that alternative energy. We need to coordinate development, we need to coordinate storage, we need to coordinate so many things that it really does become this orchestra that's essential. And we need disruptive innovation. And that is probably basic science more than anything. And it's not something that a lot of people focus on, but I do. And when you have directed policy and directed research that says, well, let's have a better outcome with electric vehicles. Let's have a more carbon neutral footprint with another process. That's directed research. That is almost always inefficient. And think about those innovations that created the modern world in the first place. Let's think about thermodynamics and electromagnetism and then quantum mechanics. Basic science, but it's thermodynamics that drove the first steam engines, drove the first industrial revolution, and changed the world. But it's understanding that basic science that enabled it. And the same thing with electromagnetism. It's electricity, right? And even when electricity was first generated by Faraday, people didn't quite understand what use could it really be. Yet without the electrical grid, we have no modern society. And of course, quantum mechanics and that understanding enables the science of very small things, which is integrated circuits and all the devices that we use. Now we need basic fundamental research and scientific breakthroughs to really solve this issue, because the world wants to be prosperous. The world wants power. We have to find a way to create power that doesn't destroy the world, right? So we have to break that cycle. And that's why there's a couple of areas that are very interesting, just to mention them. I talk about fusion and geothermal engineering, right? So this is some basic science that still needs a lot of work. Now, of course, fusion energy, the way the sun works, converting hydrogen to helium, would solve the Earth's energy problem. And it's a clean way of generating energy. It's also, right now, basically scientifically impossible. They're making some breakthroughs, but there's a joke that fusion energy has been 20 years away for 50 years. And that's true. So the problem is that if we can solve the intense energy that's required to generate fusion in the first place, while having residual energy that can then supply on enough capacity, we've solved a problem. We still need basic science to really enable that. Geothermal engineering, well, the Earth's core is very hot. And if we can tap into that heat, we've also solved our problem with a very clean source of energy. Now, we need to drill down about 4,000 feet in order to get there. Right now, the best we can do is less than 2,000 feet. That's not just simply keeping going, right? There's a lot of geology, there's a lot of pressures, there's a lot of understandings of basic science and innovation that's needed. But those 2 programs in and of themselves represent a fundamental breakthrough that can essentially change the world for the better. So it's worth investing in basic science. An electric vehicle isn't going to do anything to make this problem any better, but these things really can. And there's other basic science as well that's needed, but that's really where I think the fundamental focus can be. All right. So another area which, particularly interests us is life sciences, right? So what we've seen is tremendous breakthroughs in how we can develop drugs and how we can understand how these processes work, right? So large-scale artificial intelligence from DeepMind solved the problem of understanding protein folding. And that's a big deal, right? Because all things exist because amino acids combined to create a protein. Those proteins folded together, and that folding told your body what to do. So this is a way to enhance drug development, target diseases very cost effectively, and also effectively regarding side effects and other draconian efforts to cure serious disease, we may be able to overcome. And these developments are just now beginning to have tremendous breakthroughs. The other thing that this enables is, I call it a platform. I mean, it's a lot like software. I mean, if you think about it, the body is essentially the world's best software system. So we have a software platform that may give us real insight into the fundamental causes of disease. And one of the areas that is getting a lot of attention is inflammation, specifically intracellular inflammation. Because, for instance, there are 200 types of cancers that are categorized. Well, maybe there's really fundamentally at the cellular level or within a cell one cause for all of that. And maybe there's an understanding where we can now have a fundamental therapy that can treat so many diseases, because perhaps even heart disease and metabolic disease like diabetes and all of these things may ultimately just come from this sort of fundamental inflammation. Now that can be addressed, and that's where the intensity of software development, technology, artificial intelligence, data processing, all of these things can enable an understanding of this area, which is something we really didn't think about before. And when you look at the real breakthroughs with messenger RNA, with CRISPR technology, these things that are really leading to some very interesting new developments, new therapies, new vaccines, obviously with the pandemic. There's something also fundamental going on. And I'm saying that synthetic biology, which is thought of as, well, we're going to create a bunch of Frankenstein monsters. But what it really does at its core is it understands evolution and uses what evolution has solved long ago to our benefit. And CRISPR is a great example of that. So CRISPR technology is essentially bacteria's way of fighting viruses. And it's taken 3 billion years, but bacteria figured out really well how to fight viruses. Now we're simply using that very process and that insight to edit DNA, but it's really fundamentally understanding this evolutionary process that can be used to our advantage. And that's one of the other areas that, from now on, will continue to create more and more great opportunities. And then also touching on financial technology, which, of course, we've had the catastrophe of FTX and all the other related entities. We can go on and start naming probably dozens pretty soon. But that is a sideshow. That it's always been sort of this hyperbolic thing off to the side that is not regulated. It's centralized, it's controlled, and essentially it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy with no fundamental foundation to it, right? That's to be ignored. What's really going on is there's an ability via digitization to disintermediate, but it's disintermediating fund flows, it's disintermediating transactions, it's an ability to create, I call it the real disintermediation, right? So it's this ability to take currency or a digital asset, but something that's a real asset. It's whether it's backed by a dollar or a euro, it's digitized, but it can be transferred very easily, securely on a blockchain platform, and that can revolutionize finance. So now anyone can invest in anything, anywhere, with a currency they can depend on. And also it can be a security, right? It can be, equity ownership can be digitized in a digital form, and that can be a secure form, and it can be recorded. But this is where you need regulators, you need legal enforcement. You have a contract with a digital asset. Well, if you don't have the right jurisdiction, you have no legal enforcement, as I think the creditors to FTX are going to find out, right? So the government needs to play a vital role. You need to have the central banks involved. You need to have central governments involved, because you need enforcement, you need stable securities, you need stable valuations, but that enables tremendous opportunity for funds flows and investments and more commerce. And that's the real financial technology and the real evolution. But all of that needs to coexist. And you just can't have some made up coin that just a bunch of people buy as a speculative asset, but the greater fool eventually leaves. And as we've said, it's not musical chairs, because in this case, with those kinds of securities, when the music stops, there are no chairs. There's nothing left to sit on. But in this case, financial technology as digital infrastructure that's secure and regulated, and there's oversight and verification, that creates some very interesting, efficient business models. And so finally, one of the things that we've mentioned before, more than 10 years ago, we said, okay, software will eat the world, right? And software is still eating the world, right? Because these solutions in software become much more cost effective, much more dynamic. They can be applied more globally. Not too long ago, you came up with a product. It was in a box. You had to make that box. You had to sell that box. You distributed it maybe in the United States, maybe 6 months later in Europe, maybe a year later in Asia. Now you flip a switch and you have global distribution. So that's one of the fundamental changes to products and distribution that software has enabled, among other things. Software now is sort of running the world on all systems, processes, platforms, and it's this kind of interconnection. Now that's existed already. Now we've talked about Web 3.0 as being maybe more hype than anything. It has its place because there's interactive creativity going on, but that is not what's really happening. It's cyberspace, right? It's doing things interactively on the web. It's a virtual interaction that already exists, right? We don't need to communicate in a virtual world of 3.0. We already communicate in a virtual world of Zoom, right? That's just cyberspace. So I call it Web 2.5 because it's not that disruptive and innovative, but it's an advancement. And we have an ability to create products in a more virtual environment. And that's very positive. So interconnection, communication, more efficiency to all those processes. But what does that really mean going forward? Well, it means that the intermediaries win. Like just in the days of the railroads, the picks and shovel guys made the most money. Well, now it's the intermediaries who are making the chips, making the software that enables the transfer of files, virtual file management, virtual data management, data networking, data edge management, communication management. These are the big opportunities. And whether or not you're creating some virtual world to play a game or do something else, I mean, that's fine, but that's not where the real big opportunity is and where the real modernization and efficiency, and I consider the disruption, is going to occur. Right? So sort of just to summarize all of this, we have artificial intelligence, which is really the modern version of the sharpened tool. It enables us to create so many other things that we just couldn't create before, and that will permeate all industry. Whether you think you're being impacted by software, you're always impacted by software. And this new industrial revolution means that we're starting to create inefficiencies by fragmenting the globalized world. Well, those inefficiencies need to be overcome. And that is what the new industrial revolution means. It means it's going to exist in software. It's going to be allocated more effectively. Communications need to be allocated more effectively. We need to have more localized, edge-based communication that's more effective and secure. And those are real development opportunities. Power is the key. How do we generate power? Because the world wants power. And that's billions more people will want power. That creates an existential crisis for us. We need to solve that problem because people are not going to give up their prosperity. And we've seen that many, many times over. And so we need to have fundamental scientific breakthrough. Basic knowledge needs to be enhanced. And therefore we need to have, on the long term, real innovation. And it is going to be a long term. We're not going to be carbon neutral by, pick it, 2035, 2050, maybe not even by 2070, right? We really need to make some fundamental breakthroughs if we're going to solve the problem. Even if it takes longer, a solution is better than just a bunch of inefficient approaches. And so within life sciences, what's really fascinating there is we're combining modern science with software, with developmental innovations, but also understanding what evolution is really doing. So the innovations have enabled us to really understand, and CRISPR is the best example, like what has really happened in nature over time, because that's been tested, that works. So how can we take something that works and apply it to something that's useful for us? And that's what innovation in technology and life sciences is really enabling. And so finally, financial technology, well, it's a big deal because now we can digitize assets, but we need regulation, we need government enforcement, we need people that we were sworn enemies of before. Well, they are needed now, and I think that can create tremendous opportunity where you're disintermediating to the entire world, right? There's a global opportunity and a global market for everything. Things do not need to be in fragmented markets, whether they're in New York or London or Singapore or wherever. They can be global. That's the big opportunity, and that still needs to be developed, but now that has to happen not independent of government regulation and oversight, but in partnership with them. And then finally, yes, software continues to eat the world. These solutions will be found fundamentally in software, and it's software development that will impact life sciences, it will impact financial technology, it will impact power, it will impact all these areas. And the intermediary to markets, the intermediary to innovation and technology is going to be found through software development, and software enhancements. And that's the real opportunity. And going forward, these areas look most exciting, even beginning as early as next year, which is, next month. But this will all be happening very soon.